All right. We are live with the Supreme Court decision 2023 reaction. I'm here with co-hosts from the Red Power Hour. We have Elena Ortiz and Melanie Yazzie. This is Nick Estes signing on live.
Our what's the word? Our poorly produced podcast. We don't even have like real sound for an indication that we're live. But yeah, it's a Saturday afternoon. We thought that this would be a good idea. This is Melanie, by the way. We thought that this would be a good idea, just because, last year Roe v. Wade was overturned, right? And there were important cases related to Native people, to sovereignty, to Indian country, important decisions that were handed down by SCOTUS last summer. And I guess maybe I just didn't notice this in the past, but I feel like every June will now become like getting punched in the face repeatedly season. I know there's a lot of things that happen in June, but now that there's this slew of very impactful and long-term impactful cases or decisions being handed down by SCOTUS, I believe June will become the season for this from this point forward. So it just seemed important for us to get on here and to just talk about all of these decisions and their implications and try to provide some sort of political analysis.
By SCOTUS, we do mean the Supreme Court of the United States. And I just taught a law, sovereignty, and treaties class last semester, and we tried to do a comprehensive kind of reading of the major Supreme Court decisions for federal Indian law and their implications for the present. I had it kind of in preparation for this expected ICWA decision. But basically, if we want to just jump right into it, I mean, we've done several recordings on the Supreme Court, but I mean, one thing that I find really fascinating is how elevated the Supreme Court is in society and how it's one of the most undemocratic institutions. And I think for Native people, it's even more so because you add a layer of colonialism into it. I think, I have a lot to say about Neil Gorsuch, who's kind of been heralded as the defender of Indian rights on the Supreme Court. And I have some comments about him. But basically, I'll say this, off the bat, reading Neil Gorsuch's opinions on Indian rights is like reading papers that I grade and give them an A in my undergraduate courses.
Slow clap, Neil.
Yeah, there's nothing exceptional about this man, other than that he's a Christian theocratic fascist who happens to support elements of indigenous rights through his very narrow reading of the Constitution. And I don't know if that's something, this is the problem, I think, with the Supreme Court itself writ large, whether it's, progressive justices or right-wing theocratic fascists, such as the majority of, or if not all of the Trump appointed federal judges on the bench right now. But I think what happens is that it also is just kind of a metaphor for American society writ large, because they're making consequential decisions over people's daily lives and we have zero input whatsoever. But yet we also act like, as commentators of people who comment in the media, we act as if our opinions matter, right? And I think it's also worth pointing out that even if you read these opinions, if you can stomach reading these opinions, they're written in this kind of like really coded language of like, this Supreme Court decision, this Supreme Court decision. But they're also influenced by what are called friends of the court. I think it's called like amicus curiae or something like that. Doesn't matter. It's some weird Latin word. Doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter if you know that word or not. What you need to know, though, is that like politicians, Supreme Court justices can be lobbied by special interests. And many of the opinions that they write, they do not write themselves. They often just copy and paste legal analyses from, and it's for the left as well. So like, or for the progressive kind of bench as well. the progressive kind of legal community. So they're, they might take elements from, like, let's say, ACLU briefs to the court. So that's important to point out, right? That they're not some kind of, like, godlike figures. They're influenced just like all the politicians are by a lot of money. So when all of these reports come out of people like Clarence Thomas getting flown around the world by his, Christian fascist billionaire buddies, it's a little bit deeper than that, because it's also influencing their decisions, right, and the kinds of opinions and legal briefs that they read. And you can hold me to that. I don't believe in kind of reproducing that elitist system. And there are kind of law schools out there at Ivy Leagues. God bless them for writing these briefs and trying to influence judges. But I don't think it's a system worth replicating or reproducing into the future, because it's fundamentally at odds with basic human needs and rights, because we see how easily they strip them away from us.
They're supposed to police themselves. One of the few organizations that is required to police themselves, or to create rules as to their conduct. And we can see how well that's gone with Clarence Thomas and Alito also taking what amounts to enormous sums of money from people hoping to influence decisions.
So I took one constitutional law class. I was a political science major when I was an undergraduate, so this was a long time ago. But my professor wrote like an award-winning book that year. He's a con law specialist. That's his specialty in the field of political science. He gave me the only F I've ever gotten ever in my academic career, from the time I was in like preschool to the time that I got my PhD in 2016. And he gave me an F on a paper where I essentially made an argument. I forgot what it's called in the field of constitutional law, but thinking about the influence of what Gorsuch called the atmosphere in his dissenting opinion with the Navajo Nation versus Arizona water rights case that they just handed down, was it this week or last week? But it's kind of like the socio-political context and how much of an influence that has on how the Supreme Court justices interpret the Constitution. And so I made an argument in that paper, my little junior, undergrad self, that actually the socio-political context has a very powerful influence on the way that Supreme Court justices interpret the Constitution. And I don't remember, maybe my con law professor is like an originalist. Maybe he has, because there's different schools of how people, there's different schools of thought about how the Constitution should be interpreted, or how scholars of the Supreme Court and the Constitution see Supreme Court justices interpreting the law, right? And so the socio-political context argument is one of them that is very often and swiftly denounced by originalists, right? By kind of people who think of the law as something pure that's removed from like the historical material conditions in which those decisions are being made. And Gorsuch, I think, is one of these people. I was reading some background on him. He, like many others, uses what I think is a very convenient interpretation of the Constitution, where the law is removed from society, or like somehow it's possible to separate the law from politics. So if you want to pursue a political avenue, then you go to Congress. But if you want to pursue like a real legal avenue, then you go to the Supreme Court, is kind of like conventional thinking around how you find redress for something, like water rights, the adjudication of water rights for the Navajo Nation, for example. And so all I'm saying is that there's a very, it's an easy argument to make that the law is removed from the socio-political context of its making and of its fashioning, and that there's this very like limited language in even his dissenting opinion in the decision about the Navajo Nation water rights issue, that is very focused on the microcosm, and the language is very carefully selected to only be about the legal parameters of like treaties being the supreme law of the land. And because he's an originalist, he really believes in like what the Constitution says, and that we should stick to what the Constitution says, which from what I can tell is the only reason why he cares about treaties at all. Because the Constitution says we're supposed to care about treaties. It's not like he has a soft place in his heart for Native people. I mean, you just need to read the language. And so there's this like fiction, right, that's created in the field of constitutional law, and I'm probably going to piss off a lot of people by saying this, that somehow politics and law are removed from each other. But what you just said, right, about Nick, about, you know, Supreme Court justices are lobbied, right? They lift the perspectives from what would be considered biased institutions or biased practitioners of the law, biased perspectives, and they, you know, lump and dump those sometimes, or that influences the way that they write their opinions on these major decisions like this. And so it just seems like silly, but also really deceptive for these legal practitioners, including Supreme Court justices, to, like Gorsuch, to continue to claim that they're just like interpreting pure law and pure constitution, when it's just like so obvious that that's not true, and that the process of these decisions is political as much as it is legal.
It's like I kind of think of it like propaganda, where the police can like murder and kill people with impunity. But they kind of have this like kind of insular logic where it's like, well, we still need the police, and they're the protectors of law and order, and this is what they do. And it's like, it's actually not what they do. And that's why you need kind of structural analyses of society. Like the Supreme Court was created not to enforce equality, not to expand rights. It was created by Indian killers and slave owners primarily, but the ruling class to uphold their interests. So it's an articulation of their rights and their interests fundamentally, right? And you know, the Gorsuch is kind of fascinating in the sense that he cited a law piece by this guy named Oblofsky, and I've read a lot of his work. Sorry to get into the weeds on this. We actually did a podcast episode on this about the drafting of the Constitution. And the original intent, if we do look at it in a textual kind of understanding of the Constitution itself, you know, it's meant for the extermination of Native people fundamentally. And I am a little bit wary to see like how far he's going to take the logic of the Constitution, or if one of his, you know, smarter conservative justices actually wants, you know, fellow judges or whatever, wants to go in and be like, well, actually, you know, if we look at the founding fathers and we look at their original writings when they were talking about the Constitution and the drafting of the Constitution, they actually imagined a world in which Native people and Native nations would eventually be overtaken by the United States and fundamentally exterminated, because that's the language. What precedes the Constitution in the articulation of the United States as a nation state? It's the Declaration of Independence, right? That's one step. That's one. I mean, that's the initial step for creation, right? Merciless Indian savages. It's an extermination clause within the Declaration of Independence to wage, you know, essentially savage war against Native people. That we are war against Native people is not beholden to the same standards, the same civil, quote unquote, civilized standards of regular warfare, right? That women and children are targets, civilians are targets, you know, non-combatants are targets. And that's actually upheld within things such as like the Northwest Ordinance, which is one of the first territorial laws that the Congress had actually passed, which was the annexation of what became, you know, the Northwest, or the Ohio River Valley up into Michigan, et cetera. And that laid out a theory of warfare based on the Constitution that allowed settler militias and the regular army to essentially wage campaigns of extermination if Native people did not adhere to the kind of diplomatic arm of the United States. Because there's two thoughts within the Constitution. One is, it's basically treaty. It's like trick or treaty. It's like you get exterminated, or, you know, the Michael Myers version, you will send Michael Myers after you and he cannot be stopped. He will murder and murder and murder. He's the faceless, nameless kind of ahistorical force of history called genocide. Or you can sign a treaty with us and we'll take your land, right? That was the original intent of the founding fathers, and it's very unambiguous. It's very clear in the language in the Federalist Papers and in the thinking of the drafters of the Constitution. So what I'm saying here, it's not to maybe I'm being a little bit soapboxy, but what I'm saying here is that there is no legal remedy within the Constitution for Native people to expand our rights, and to actually fundamentally exist within this land in perpetuity, right? Because we could, over the generations, there's been sympathetic judges like Gorsuch, but they've never expanded and never sustained the kind of very fabric of what it means to be an Indigenous person in the United States. And I want to sorry to just keep jumping on this like bandwagon here, but I do want to bring up two kind of issues, and that's the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because if Neil Gorsuch was a true defender of the Native Americans, he would have understood something like the Hyde Amendment fundamentally discriminates against Native people and Native nations and building reproductive health clinics on their reservations, because it disallows federal funding for abortion access, right? Why is that? Why does that exception exist for Native people who now have to go to states and then are subject to state sovereignty and state laws that, like in places like South Dakota, that are fundamentally anti-women, anti-LGBTQ? What kind of sovereignty is that when we've signed treaties ceding land or getting health benefits, but we're actually categorically denied those health benefits? The ways that places like, we don't get a vote like a state. We don't get to make a law like a state to enshrine and to enforce and to protect access to abortion. So him overturning Roe v. Wade is fundamentally anti-Indigenous, and nobody's holding him to account on that. He's just kind of getting this elite, pat on the back by, these legal jurists who think they've convinced him that we're human.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, the example you just point out, in terms of how the decision in which he was in the majority about Roe v. Wade a year ago, how that is anti-Indian because of the way that it impacts funding for reproductive rights or just services, in reservations or probably in trust land, I'm assuming, where that applies. I think it's important for people to understand that Gorsuch isn't a champion or a hero for Native people. I don't really see in the language that he uses, again, that he has like a soft spot or a particular understanding about Native people or history, or like the question of justice at all comes into play. I think it's really just his own like very arrogant, very narrow interpretation of what it means to be an originalist and a textualist, because he claims, I don't know if he claims to be those two things, but he's been labeled as those two things, which are pretty consistent with kind of like the conservative attitude, the right-wing attitude right now about how to interpret the Constitution. And so it seems to me that he's very obsessed with like treaties and the interpretation of treaties simply because of the status that they hold within the Constitution. But as you say, Nick, he's also somebody who, he said this a lot in the dissenting opinion in the Navajo Nation versus Arizona decision, that the intent, right? He's very interested in understanding and interpreting the intent at the time that a law was put into place. How did people understand the Treaty of 1868, for example, that the Navajo people were entering into with the United States, both Navajo leaders, but then also the actors on behalf of the US. And so you say, right, if you're trying to understand the intent behind the actors who created the Constitution, the intent was very clear. It was removal. It was land dispossession, right? The term merciless Indian savage is baked into that. And so if you're trying to understand the intent, which he seems to be he claims that is like one of the primary ways in which he approaches the interpretation of the Constitution, then it is actually incredibly disturbing to think about how far he's going to go if that is one of the main criteria that he uses and how he interprets the Constitution, particularly in relationship to Native people. And so it's important to like listen to how he speaks and like how he rationalizes the decisions that he's making, that even though they may appear to be like pro-Indian or like pro-sovereignty, like actually what's factoring into that comes from what I can tell, a very different place. And maybe, yeah, like you said, maybe people are pulling at his heartstrings in terms of like being a friend to Native people. But under no circumstances should we understand him as a friend to Native people. And there's a reason why, we in society at large understand and understand like the appointment process of Supreme Court justices through the political process, because Neil Gorsuch can't be removed from the fact that he's a conservative. What'd you call him? A theological fascist? Something like that, Nick? Because he is.
Theocratic fascist.
He's a theocratic fascist, and he's very consistent, very vocal in that regard. So that's just something that I wanted to add to that.
I don't know if we want to like kind of switch gears here and kind of focus on, because I read a couple of the opinions, and a couple of the analysis, or some of the analysis that came out of it. But one thing that I have a firm grasp on the ICWA decision, but I don't have a firm grasp on like the Navajo Nation decision. So maybe should we just do kind of like an overview of some of these, and then maybe go into the other ones around allowing Christians to discriminate against LGBTQ people, like, which is going back to theocratic fascism, or even the striking down of affirmative action at private and public universities. So if we can just start with the Navajo Nation water rights case, and then work through ICWA, and then talk about these other two. That works.
Yeah, I can try to give a brief breakdown. The case called Navajo Nation versus Arizona, I think it became Navajo Nation versus the Department of the Interior when it was seen and argued before the Supreme Court earlier this year. But after many other mechanisms, the Navajo Nation filed a suit against the United States, and simply asking, claiming that the federal government had breached its trust obligations to the Navajo Nation. The trust responsibility is a central facet of the relationship, the legal relationship between Indigenous nations and the United States government. It's complicated. It comes from different places. Sometimes it comes from treaties. It's been whittled down or expanded through various Supreme Court decisions in the history of federal Indian policy. But nevertheless, the claim is basically that, in its trust responsibilities and obligations to the Navajo Nation, the federal government, which has authority over the adjudication or the quantification of water rights for multiple parties, not just tribes like the Navajo Nation, that the United States government needs to uphold its trust obligation to the Navajo Nation by going through a process of quantifying the Navajo Nation's rights to the waters in the Colorado River. So that's basically what the case was. That's what the Navajo Nation was asking. And it was a 5-4 decision, so it was quite close. Of course, Neil Gorsuch was on the dissenting, and he wrote the dissenting opinion for that. I guess I didn't read, I think Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion for that decision. But those who chose to strike down the lawsuit the Navajo Nation was waging against the U.S. government used the Tucker Act of 1887, and claiming that there's like this whole complicated process about the sovereign immunity of the United States when it comes to tribes filing suits for various things, civil suits against the U.S. government. And so they interpreted what the Navajo Nation was doing. My understanding was a type of suit, a civil suit against the U.S. government, and that the United States has sovereign immunity against those suits. And so the president of the Navajo Nation, who I don't like very much, but he issued a statement kind of in response to the decision on behalf of the Navajo Nation government. And he said the right thing. He's like, actually, this was about the treaty. This was the 1868 treaty that was struck at Bosque Redondo with the U.S. government. The Winters Doctrine from 1908 stipulates, that like treaties, and that treaty in particular provides a quote unquote permanent homeland for the Navajo people, and that it's very central to the brokering of that treaty and the language around that treaty that access to water, for establishing a permanent homeland was very much at the center of the language in that treaty. And again, the intent, behind the actors who brokered that treaty all those years ago. And so it's not unreasonable, to ask the federal government to fulfill the trust obligations it has through the treaty that it struck with the Navajo Nation, what later became the Navajo Nation, to quantify those water rights. And the Navajo Nation wasn't asking for, the U.S. government to provide millions of dollars, usually through a congressional appropriation for infrastructure or anything. They were simply asking for the process of quantifying and determining their water rights to the Colorado River to be started and mediated by the United States government. Of course, leading up to the decision, I don't know if people noticed this, but I was reading editorials and, the opposition, the state of Arizona, Colorado, and Nevada, I think argued in front of the Supreme Court against the lawsuit prior to the decision coming out this week. And they were all basically raising these alarm bells and being incredibly dramatic, right? That, if the Navajo Nation wins this case, then this is going to mean that like all these tribes, are going to make a grab for water. And then that's going to compromise, the economic development and the integrity of like these millions of other Americans who depend upon the Colorado River for water. And so there were political interests working against the Navajo Nation and probably trying to curry favor with SCOTUS in order to push this in the direction that I would say the industry in the American West, as well as these, settler states have. And I wanted to say one other thing. High Country News and ProPublica just published, I don't know if it was a series of stories, but it was a very excellent story that detailed an investigative report that detailed the history of Arizona's relationship with tribes when it comes to water rights. And Arizona, in particular, is incredibly hostile to the indigenous nations that fall within the boundaries of that state and have historically really held tribes at ransom and have made the most ridiculous demands and have attached ridiculous demands to tribes in order to coerce tribes into settling water rights, usually in a diminished capacity compared to what they would be, they would have rights to under the Winters Doctrine, which can possibly be construed as quite large, actually, the number of water rights, or I mean, the number of acre feet per year that they would have rights to. And so it's not surprising to me that this decision came, I'm disappointed, but it's not surprising to me that this decision came down from the Supreme Court, given the history of Arizona's relationship with tribes when it comes to water. Because, I mean, really, if you just look at the facts, Arizona just simply doesn't want to give up rights to water because its entire economic lifeblood depends on water. And the more that tribes have a right and use of that water, the less basically settler industry and development and cities have actual wet water to use for, their interests of growth and just continuing to live in that place. So that's a little bit of a breakdown of that case. That case, if they had one, I mean, it would have been a really big deal, not just for the Navajo Nation. I think it would have been a big deal for water rights for tribes all over the United States.
I'll kind of give a breakdown of the Supreme Court ruling to uphold the Indian Child Welfare Act. And, you can read, I wrote an opinion piece in The Guardian kind of breaking down what this means. But essentially, there was a white couple in Texas who wanted to adopt a child from the Navajo Nation, but then felt like they had faced barriers because they were racially discriminated against because they were identified as a white couple. And they challenged the Indian Child Welfare Act, and they're one of several kind of, I guess, plaintiffs on this case. And they joined kind of several other families who also wanted to adopt Native children, and felt like they had been unfairly discriminated against in state court for adopting that. And they were also challenging like the fact that state courts are kind of beholden to this federal law, and also beholden to kind of tribal kind of preference when it comes to adopting out children or placing them within homes. And basically, the Indian Child Welfare Act was created in 1978 to reverse, centuries of family separation and Indian child removal. And, that's just those are just really fancy ways of just saying genocide, right? A state policy of genocide, meaning that the United States has passed and has practiced within, the adoption system, within the state kind of system, even in places like Minnesota, where it's actually Indian child removal is higher than in other places, even though they have, sort of this kind of progressive history, but also within federal policy that's ordering, children to be sent to either off-reservation boarding schools, or to be placed, in some kind of foster care system because, their families are negligent, quote unquote negligent. But this was an attempt, at the time, which one study found, and these are the kind of the investigations that were conducted. One study found that between 25 to 35% of Native children had been adopted out, or put into foster care systems and were placed into families, and 95% of the time in white families over Indian families. So this was kind of responding to this practice and pattern of adopting out into white families. There has been, a lot of pushback against the Indian Child Welfare Act, and it's kind of seen as a backdoor in sort of characterizing tribal nations as, or American Indians in the United States as, kind of racial groups that have some kind of protected status that violates equal protections and things of that nature, and also violate state sovereignty because, state family court shouldn't be beholden to tribal sovereignty. There's supposed to be a separation. That's the argument that the kind of these families brought with their, corporate Wall Street law firms, like Gibson Dunn, who are also defending and, taking on cases for places like, Chevron and Shell. They actually led the prosecution against Steve Donziger. So these are some very kind of high-powered individuals, and they were showing up to, family court, kind of this pedestrian proceeding of custody, in places like Minnesota, where a grandmother was trying to get her child back, who, from her daughter, etc. So the families essentially just claimed reverse racism and saying they were being discriminated against because they're non-Indians, right? And the Supreme Court, luckily ruled a 7-2 decision to uphold the Indian Child Welfare Act. And of course, Neil Gorsuch, wrote for the majority. He didn't write the majority opinion, but he wrote a concurring opinion. I believe it was Amy Coney Barrett who wrote the majority opinion, and it was really just basic. I thought it was just really poor writing to begin with. It's really boring. That's my critique, I guess. Actually, Neil Gorsuch, whoever writes his stuff, is actually fairly decent sometimes. He makes these bold statements, but then they're kind of like, it's like a letdown at the end, because it's kind of like, wah, wah, it's like, oh, like you're making really surface arguments. But anyways, or he's just like pointing out like Captain Obvious things, like the things that Native people already know. But the United States has been so successful at eliminating any kind of true history of the United States itself, and the fact that this is all stolen land, that people find it really revolutionary that he's just basically saying things that we've already said and has already been well documented. But congrats to him on that. Way to go, Neil. Anyways, I think it's interesting because, he sadly is the only justice on the Supreme Court who actually takes serious Indian law. Even in their concurring opinions, Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, they concurred with him, except that they didn't like his assertion that his assertion that the principle that Congress has quote unquote plenary power, which is like final authority over the very existence of Native people, conflicts with the original understanding of the Constitution. So that's a pretty big difference. It basically.
Wait, can you repeat that?
Okay, this is kind of getting into the
I haven't
read
this. I haven't read the opinion on this yet.
Yeah, it seems like a minor point, but it's actually incredibly huge. So Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Sotomayor did not agree with Neil Gorsuch's opinion that the original interpretation of the Constitution doesn't grant Congress plenary power over Native tribes, meaning they think that Congress should still hold plenary power. These two progressive justices.
No.
It's like, yeah. It's like it's basically saying, yes, the settler government has a right to extinguish Native tribes or Native people, if they so, they see fit. They basically are upholding the principle that allowed for termination and family separation to begin, as a policy. So this is what's so problematic. And there's two arguments here, and I think this is kind of like, I kind of want to give a parallel kind of case example here. So like we see Neil Gorsuch, who's like doing Federal Indian Law 101, and most people who read and study Federal Indian Law 101 like are like, wow, this is like you just like literally created a whole new set of rules for Native people that don't make sense. Like you introduced this concept of the doctrine of discovery, which didn't exist until 1823. You just made it up.
And plenary power. It's
and
literally like
power.
A fiction of the court. Like it was just created to facilitate further land dispossession. Seriously, sorry. Just look at the history.
It's true, and this is what's really frustrating about this. It's because why is it that this very right-wing, reactionary, anti-gay, sexist, whatever you want to call them, all the labels in the book, is doing the proper reading of the Constitution and the kind of fiction of plenary power, and the two so-called liberal progressive judges actually think he's wrong and are upholding a fictive standard to say that Congress has the authority to basically eliminate Native people how they see fit. That to me is like appalling. But it also lends itself to this, this broader, I think, critique that I have of kind of sort of the liberal and progressive kind of wing of trying to enshrine rights, because they're all individual. They're all kind of based on this kind of individual rights framework. And you see this problem happen within the pretendian conversation. Sorry to take it there, but we have to take it there because I have some things to say about the affirmative action thing and pretendianism. But the pretendian thing is an individual having the right to claim an entire history, right, over the collective rights of actual existing nations to say, no, this is who we are. We exist in the past, we exist in the present, and we have a future orientation collectively, and we have a land base, and we have our own membership rules, all these other things, right? The individual within all of these Supreme Court cases, whether they're ruled in our favor or not, are always kind of fetishized as the final bearer of rights and truth, right? And this is why I think the kind of liberal democratic system is fundamentally flawed. And there are, I think Native sovereignty within this framework actually offers an alternative. And I would also say that, like, things like the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, also offer a framework for collective rights for Black people in this country as well. But they're often framed within this kind of civil rights discourse of like the individual being kind of the rights bearing kind of subject, not the collective. And I think here you see that kind of friction happening, right? Where you have these progressive judges siding with this idea that, like, well, Congress is the final decision-making power. It's not these nations who've actually existed before the Constitution and in spite of the Constitution, right? So I think that's an important kind of point to make here in this situation, because it gets to sort of other questions around the court and then the application and interpretation of the law. And finally, I just want to say that it seems to me very absurd, we're living in absurd times, that the Pope a couple of months ago repudiated the doctrine of discovery, right? If you read the whole thing, it's kind of this thing where it's like, well, we never really believed in that, you guys, so we don't know why they took it up. And it's like, okay, if you never really believed in that, then just give back all the things you took from us. But like my friends, we got out after we repudiated the doctrine of discovery. We just broke into the neighbor's house and like set up shop. And no, I'm just joking. We didn't do that. But it seems absurd that even the Pope and the Holy See, not known to be progressive or revolutionary for any means, by any means, is actually saying this is a legal fiction. So why is the United States still upholding it? It's a really good question, because I don't even know if it can be overturned without an act of Congress or some kind of Supreme Court decision. But regardless, we're not there, and we won't be there in the current kind of political playing field. So even the very thing that upholds the fabric of federal Indian law, that the United States has ultimate authority to decide our rights on this land and our existence in perpetuity, is held down by a fiction that the people who actually created that fiction are saying, yeah, it's actually a fiction. It's like it's not a real thing. That we're still like going through the motions as if these Supreme Court justices are actually smart and like intelligent people, and that they're making the right decisions with all the facts, when people who actually made the facts up are saying, hey, we made these facts up and you need to stop using them because it's a joke, and the rest of the world thinks it's a joke.
While you were talking, Nick, I was doing a search about Gorsuch's stance on federalism, like the separation of powers between states and the feds. Because usually, like the conservative position is like a devolution, right? Like states should have more rights, and the federal government needs to like roll back the big brother hand, not on just individual rights, but on state rights. And in so doing, I had this look on my face. It wasn't in response to you, but it was in response to a New York Times article. The New York Times gets it wrong every time when it comes to Native issues. But it came out on the 15th, so just like a couple of weeks ago. But the title is Justice Neil Gorsuch is a committed defender of tribal rights. In soaring opinion steeped in history, Justice Gorsuch has demonstrated a distinctive dedication to Native American rights. And I got my, face of indignation and grouchiness when I was reading this title. Because first of all, using the terminology of rights falls into the same trap when you're talking about treaties and sovereignty and nation-to-nation relationship that Indigenous nations have with the U.S. government. Right, so categorizing that as rights is a completely incorrect understanding of that legal relationship. And also basically labeling Neil Gorsuch a hero, right, for Native people also is a gross misinterpretation. And the reason why I brought up the question of federalism, because Gorsuch is a conservative, he's a right winger, is that I guess I'm just like I'm just like very suspicious of him, and I don't think he's a hero. And I've been trying to articulate that in this episode so far, and I think you've also articulated that really well, Nick, laid out the case. But it feels like Gorsuch interprets. It might be the case that Gorsuch is interpreting kind of has a more robust interpretation, for example, of like plenary power, right, than Sotomayor Jackson. Is that the other Supreme Court justice? Sorry. Because there is an interest within the right of the federal government not having as much power, period, over individual liberties, possibly over sovereign Indigenous nations or over states who should also have a certain amount of sovereignty to make their own decisions. I know that this is speculation, but basically what I'm just trying to do is I'm trying to develop an understanding and an analysis to interpret Gorsuch's actions in the future when it comes to federal Indian law, because I just don't trust him. And I want people to understand that he's not somebody who's committed to rights, but that also he's not demonstrated a distinctive dedication to Native people. And I just think it's really important to be very critical of those kinds of understandings of his position on the court, because he's going to be on the court till he dies. And so he's going to be making a lot more decisions about the destiny and the future of Native nationhood. And we just need to be very vigilant, I guess, when it comes to him in particular.
Yeah, I agree. There needs to be a more critical piece on him, and just kind of, I think what I also really don't like about the law, and why you need kind of analyses is that in this rights-based framework, Native people are in some kind of silo, and like Neil Gorsuch does the treaty stuff, but apparently we don't get accepted into colleges. We don't, have same-sex marriages where we're going to be getting wedding cakes, or we don't have abortions or need access to reproductive care. We're like, this is what the Supreme Court does, is disintegrates all these rights, and somehow we're not included in those categories, right? We're just like, we just have treaties, and it's true, but treaties are more robust than these kind of very narrow kind of frameworks. Like the interpretations that Neil Gorsuch is making might have held water like 50 years ago in like history courses. Like people will be like, yes, you'd have like, he would be like, this kind of guy who wears like a cowboy hat and wears the kind of Western bolo ties, and he would walk in and like just like blow all of his white law school students away with his like knowledge of treaties. And he'd probably grow his hair out a little bit long to kind of give himself a little bit ethnic kind of Western edgy look. But that doesn't hold weight anymore, like in any kind of field of study. It's just like old school dusty like interpretations. It never held weight within like legal circles within Native communities. It's a very kind of like it's just an old school framework. I think there's nothing new. There's nothing, we don't exist beyond his kind of narrow interpretation of us. That doesn't, and I think there's kind of an effect that happens when we kind of organize our movements or even our advocacy around these things, is that we try to speak to those kind of narrow interpretations when actually that's not how we fit and work and operate within the world. So I always caution my students, and I would like to caution our listeners from just thinking that is what that's what it means. Because why are Native children being taken from families in the first place, where we need a law to protect them, right? Why is it that the white foster care family can get $1,500 per Native, child under their care, but the mom can't even pay her rent, right? Why are we not asking, why are these, families, entering these conditions in which they're winding up homeless to begin with, right? All of those are kind of like holistic questions. And oftentimes we look at the symptom of something and not that the actual root cause. And this is what this kind of narrow kind of textualist interpret. It's such a masculine thing. It's like, yes, I'm a originalist, I'm a textualist. But it doesn't actually provide us with a real kind of analysis of what is happening and why things are happening, right? It actually mystifies social relations. It mystifies the reasons why Native children today are being taken from families, right? Even in this state, I was just sitting in a DOJ hearing, I'm going to do a podcast episode on this, but it's important, and it relates to Indian child welfare. The police often are the first people that we encounter, or that Native families encounter, when it comes to Indian child removal. If you look at the police report that came from the Minneapolis Police, or the Department of Justice, on the Minneapolis Police Department, the Minneapolis Police Department, operating in the 3rd Precinct, called themselves the Cowboys. Derek Chauvin, the man who murdered George Floyd, called himself a cowboy, and they wanted to be in that precinct so that they could beat the crap out of young Native kids. And you can read it through line by line through this very extensive report. Those Native kids, they're being put into juvenile detention facilities after they're being, traumatized and beat and like assaulted and profiled by these cops, who are then being removed from their families, whether put into juvenile detention, right? So the cops are the first interveners within all these Indian Child Welfare Act cases. And a lot of people don't realize that. So when we talk about like, abolition and things like that, it's like, it's actually directly related to ICWA. And it also kind of puts the onus, puts the analysis on the state and not the sort of social conditions that lead up to those so-called interventions. and the violence of police interventions and targeting Native youth or targeting Native people in general. And that's the fact that like we can pay the salaries of all these police officers, we can pay their retirement, because 30% of PTSD disability cases for police officers in the state of Minnesota have actually gone to the MPD because they got so traumatized from beating the shit out of little children that they now get disability funding up until their retirement to the age of 50. So this is like the extent of it, right? And so I think this very kind of narrow reading of ICWA doesn't actually give us any kind of interpretation or any kind of real analysis of what is happening on the ground and why we need something like ICWA to begin with. Sorry, I'm just like soapboxing today. I got triggered today. I had to sit through this DOJ hearing with these guys, and the families, like they brought this up. They actually brought ICWA up in the state of Minnesota because they're like, wow, you passed a law to uphold the provisions of ICWA, but Minnesota like still has some of the highest rates of Indian child removal, and you're going to come here and tell us that you guys need to like refund the police? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, what planet do you live on? These are liberals, by the way. This is like the liberal DOJ. This is Merrick Garland's kind of DOJ.
Elena, we've been taking up all the space. What are your thoughts?
No, I'm actually learning. I'm learning a lot. And it's just interesting to hear you talk about, I've never taken a law class before. So my reactions are all just sort of a lay person's reading of these things. And I've just like, just hearing all of this just makes me want to take a baseball bat to all of these institutions, and the contradictions in what Nick said both today, but also in the article he wrote for The Guardian. It struck me, it triggered me that the doctrine of discovery actually applied to children, and it applies to women as well, that colonizing nations feel that they have a right to remove children, to destroy women. And of course, from a Native perspective, women and children are the heart of the nation. So that is genocide. And to have these entitled, privileged white guys sitting on their benches and talking about Gorsuch, and he's basing all of this on an essentialist view of the Constitution rather than looking at the tribes as existing dynamic nations, just makes me want to just pass out. I don't know. I don't know what else to say about that. It just appalls me. All that you all have been saying is just, it's triggering me.
100%. I think it's one of those situations where it's like we blew a huge sigh of relief that ICWA wasn't overturned, but then it's like, it's like you keep one of your children, but then the rest are taken, right? It's like it's not a real win, and I think we should talk about the other. Were you going to say something, Elena?
Yeah, I was going to say, you can keep your children, but you're not going to be able to educate them because the structural inequalities that exist in this nation, are already three strikes against Native kids, and now we're not going to try to level that playing field by reinforcing affirmative action, which is. I have two minds about that because affirmative action refers to, of course, racial inequities and trying to assure racial diversity, and Native nations are not races, but nations. So technically, it doesn't apply to Native people, but of course we know it does. And so it's a blow. It's a huge blow, and I feel like you can't take one of these decisions without looking at them, which both of you have done, without looking at them as a whole, and that the rest of the world may be upholding Gorsuch as this champion, but actually every decision that he makes, which isn't lauded by people saying, oh, he's a champion of Indian law, is like designed to strike down at the very heart of, LGBTQ, and the right for all of us to expect a decent education for our young people, and to expect to live in relative peace and harmony, and none of that is being upheld. You can have your kids, but you're not going to have a world to live in. So there you go.
And it's a weird thing to have to breathe a sigh of relief when this apolitical, ahistorical, authoritarian, elitist institution that is allowed to completely remove itself from society and essentialize its interpretation of the law. And we all hold our breath until they tap us with the wand, as to which way they're going to go. And it's just what the actual fuck? Is this real? I made a joke in our, when you decided to hold this podcast recording, we should call this a Yoded episode. Cause I know we're talking about real things, and these SCOTUS decisions have real world impacts on people's lives, but you can't make this up, that this is a real thing, even though it feels extremely Yoded. And I think after you described, the DOJ hearing that you went to in Minnesota, Nick, and there is a profound relationship that people don't often understand between child removal and policing, for example. And so our politics of abolition need to address child removal and that history and ongoing practice. It just demonstrates how profoundly out of touch somebody like Neil Gorsuch and the way that he interprets federal Indian law. I actually hate the term federal Indian law, the way that he interprets the legal status of Indigenous nations within the so-called United States. And we're supposed to somehow celebrate that, even though it's decades behind historically from where people are actually at. And the actual truth and the reality of things. It's just it's hard to be very active and kind of to live in the space of reality as Native people who are practitioners and social and political actors, forging these histories. And then to have to kind of get out of that space and to go into the realm of constitutional law in the Supreme Court, because the way that the logic that they use is just so absurd. I mean, it is absurd if you really understand things from that perspective. It's outrageously Yoded, actually. And there's no political point there other than to say that it's wild. It's wild to have to live under these conditions. And it doesn't have to be this way, right? We don't have to accept that this is the way things are, is the other thing that maybe needs to be said. I don't know if it does.
Well, I think that's let's talk about the other ruling that came out yesterday around striking down race, quote unquote, race conscious college admissions and so-called affirmative action. I was just reading, I think it came out a couple of years ago, but I think it's still kind of important. But in 2020, there was this kind of National Student Clearinghouse and the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or AHEC, some of you might know, found that the 23% decrease in freshman enrollment among Native students at the colleges and universities throughout the country. And this is pretty wild stuff, because I remember when I graduated high school, the graduation rate in South Dakota for Native students was, I think it was, or for Native males, it was like 25%. And I think it was like 66%, or it was like maybe, gosh, I can't remember. It was a really low number, but across the board. And I actually used to work in a past life. I used to work in higher education in terms of like getting Native students to college and universities. And I don't think that a lot of Native or the university I attended, I don't think I actually benefited from uh, affirmative action on my application from at the University of South Dakota, because I think it was an automatic in because I had an ACT score that was high enough or whatever. And then I think both of my graduate level kind of admissions were based on my, I guess, my writing and my grades at my, which were somewhat decent. But I don't think I was allowed in based. It wasn't like a qualification, that wasn't like there were choosing people. But that's not to say, I think there's kind of again, when we look at this ruling, it's a very kind of narrow interpretation of like, oh, just college admissions. Like there's like, you think of like people are checking a box, and then like, there's some guy in a office room that's like setting aside all the applications, and they're like, oh, this is a white kid, we can't admit them. This is an Asian American, we can't admit that. That's not how it happens. Like, and it's so sad that the plaintiffs in this case actually created fake data around this and kind of a fake scare, and said that they were representing Asian American students who had been denied entry at Harvard, because it was, and then it was like cited in the majority opinion, because that's actually not how it works. But it's fascinating. Like, this is how like stupid these people are on the Supreme Court, is that they'll just believe the people that are telling them these alternative facts, right? Because it's not how it happens, and it's not how college admissions happens throughout this country. But it's a shot across the bow, and it might have broader social and legal implications for other cases in terms of employment, right? So now there are there was a New York Times article that came out today where employers in law firms were actually talking about how they're scared of actually hiring people based on race, because, or like to fill a diversity quota, or to fill a diversity kind of impetus to say, hey, we need more lawyers because our clients are black, so we should probably have some black lawyers, or our clients are native, so we should have some native lawyers. They're now afraid of being sued for that, right? So you're seeing this kind of broader kind of scare around like, well, if they're going to go after affirmative action in college admissions, like, are they going to go after it elsewhere? And I think it's really important to point out, though, that like the double kind of standard, or the dual systems of justice and law, right? So military academies are exempt. They can continue to recruit and admit based on race. Now, why is that? Because the United States needs a diverse army of the poor, and they also need a diverse army of the poor officer corps to command the diverse army of the poor. So you will have more equality within the U.S. Army and fighting for imperialism than you will in just living in society, because so it's protected status for military academies, but not universities, even though they're both. I would say military academies are more publicly funded than even public universities. So this is the standards that the Supreme Court is setting out. And somebody was saying, I was listening to a podcast one time, and they were saying like, basically all the things that should be available for like everyday people, whether it's healthcare, whether it's access to higher education, funding, are all provided for cops and the military. And it's not to say that people who join the military are somehow like privileged or whatever, but they do get access to things that everyday Americans don't get access to. And now they have protected kind of diversity and racial conscious application processes, which I think is really funny, because it's like, you guys are so anti-woke, but you're like keeping the wokeness in the military. It just blows my mind. And the last thing I want to say about this is like the university systems never actually took serious American Indian identity. They might have taken serious the question of Indigenous identity writ large, but Indigenous is a pretty big category. It's almost a useless category, in my opinion, because if we look at my university, for example, the University of Minnesota, it is a land grant institution. It literally created an affirmative action program for white people in this state for education, right? Because we didn't go to this school. We were genocided. And they took our land to raise money for white people to have access to education in this country. So like we've never even, like, I don't even think affirmative action program was meant to address that issue because nobody even knows about it. Nobody even really cares about it, right? But I want to also say that like it's kind of open, the creation of these affirmative action programs and, whether or not we agree with, I mean, there are elements that are just like not working, right? I think when we left it up to universities to decide who is Native American and who isn't Native American, or who is American Indian and who isn't, look what we've gotten, or look where we've gotten ourselves. We have white people posing as Native people because they just literally checked the box, and the university is so cynical about it. They don't care. They don't care where they got their land from. They don't even know the nation. They don't even know, the tribes to negotiate them. But they don't even know the laws, because there could be laws. You could have Indian preference laws. It's actually a protected category in Title VII, in the employment, equal employment opportunities. You can use that law, but they don't want to use that law because they will actually have to be accountable to the very people whose land they stole. And they've used the money that they've used, to take that land that they sold and to create their, university funds and foundations. And University of Minnesota is not the only one. There's, there's many in many other states as well. But they are somehow claiming that Native students, Black students, etc., have some kind of perceived advantage over white students who've literally had generations of their education subsidized. It's not to say that white students shouldn't have access to education. They should. 100%. I'm a public educator. I'll fight for all students to have access to public education, but to not acknowledge the kind of historic federal subsidization of white education generation to generation in this country is like one of the biggest kind of oversights. Didn't see Neil Gorsuch out there defending land grants and the taking of native land. And in fact, he sided with the majority on that one again. Another L for Neil. Sorry. I feel like I'm just triggering Elena.
Yeah, you are. I mean, not you are. You are not. You're just saying what. I mean, so I went to a state school. I went to the University of New Mexico, so I didn't really benefit from affirmative action, but I remember having conversations about it and, just recognizing the structural inequality that exists. And when you were talking about, the education of white students, yes, everybody is entitled to an adequate education. But the legacies of generational wealth that have been created, and which particularly turns my stomach that Harvard was part of this suit, because I mean, we could talk about Harvard for hours and hours and never even touch what they've done to Native people and the collections that they have built, and the damage that they have done to Native people just by being Harvard. But the fact that this judgment is going to impact Native people who are not even really supposed to be figured into this it just blows my mind. And yes, the Asian Americans who were duped into being named in this suit or pretending to be named in this suit, like that also to me, who are we talking about? I mean, that's sort of a catch-all for a lot of different people. And maybe Asian Americans who come from relatively financially secure families have a different educational trajectory than, say, someone who is a recent immigrant. And, you know, the whole thing is just so overgeneralized. And it just needs to be looked at from a critical perspective. And just, well, I could go on about, I mean, I don't necessarily think that universities these days are a great place for Native students or people of color anyway, because they're so run by overwhelmingly by the capitalist settlers that they're just not a healthy place for people to be in the first place. But I highly support anyone who wants to go to university. And now I should shut up before I really start to piss people off.
There's a third way, the third university. I think there's actually a book called that. I'm really tired, so I've partly been stumbling through my expressions and how I'm articulating through this podcast, so I apologize for that. I'm about to stumble through something else. I haven't really thought through this particular decision. I haven't had a chance to read. I skimmed I think the dissenting opinion was written by Justice Sotomayor, and I wanted to say maybe just a couple of things that come to mind. You know, Nick talked earlier about liberals and progressives being really obsessed with rights. And that, right, the relationship of that, how we understand Native people within the social and the political and the legal landscape of the United States, of course, cannot be reduced to rights. I mean, we're not a minority, right? Like, this is something that's the Native people have said for decades and decades, right? Even though we're often interpreted and cast into that framework of rights or civil rights. Most Native claims are not civil rights claims, so that's really important to point out. That said, it is still, I have seen, okay, let me backtrack. So I'm a Ford Fellow. So the Ford Foundation Diversity Fellowship I think it was established in the 1960s, was like one of the flagship diversity funding opportunities for graduate students in the United States. And it has been for the last, 50 or 60 years. And it was retired last year. The Ford Foundation made an announcement. And I'm on a listserv of all the Ford Fellows because it's an intergenerational, right? So everyone is kind of together and we can share information with each other or whatever. But a lot of the fellows, so the Ford Fellowship was created for Native folks, for like Mexican American, and for Black folks, and for like Native Hawaiians specifically, because those three groups are the most underrepresented in the number of student bodies in U.S. colleges and universities. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because the end of the Ford Fellowship and the Ford Foundation's rationale for stopping the Ford Fellowship is that, like, we've reached a moment of equity, you know, in higher education, where we don't need this kind of incentive anymore, you know, to bring professors, you know, to bring people into faculty positions from these backgrounds. And I'm like, that's like factually not true, first of all, especially for Native people. But that happened about 6 months ago. And then the Supreme Court decision about affirmative action and college admissions was just handed down. And so what I'm saying is that these two things coupled together demonstrate a shift in thinking about equity, specifically in relationship to race in higher education. But at the same time, this also has something to do with the normalization of diversity, equity, and inclusion as an approach to rights, to like how we conceive of civil rights. And it's very attached to higher education, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is this kind of like amorphous thing that has influenced how we think about identity more largely during what I'm usually going to call the neoliberal period. There's been a lot written about this, especially in relationship to higher education. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I read a piece, and I think that this is correct, that even this decision, rolling back affirmative action in college admissions, still very much to me feels like it's engaging in like a culture war, like identity politics kind of thing, that is very consistent with, we have like a conservative position and we have like a progressive position on identity politics, and we're having a war about which one is going to continue to be, but they're both kind of still trapped in kind of this larger obsession with rights and individual rights that, again, I'm not really sure how, I think that that's created the pretendianism problem. I really do, whether it's like politically conservative or politically liberal. And I think it's still questionable how useful DEI as a framework, or just like identity politics in general, how useful that is for advancing the struggle for Native liberation. I know this might be an unpopular opinion. And so I'm not saying like I'm against diversity, equity, and inclusion. Certainly not saying I'm against affirmative action. I'm fairly certain I was a product of affirmative action because I went to my undergraduate and my master's institutions were elite private institutions where I was one of the only Native students at both of those institutions. So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the whole conversation and the way that we frame all of this is still very much in like a neoliberal mode of talking about identity in relationship to civil rights. And yes, the discrimination and the oppression and the structural racism is still very much intact, right? These communities still experience disproportionate structural violence, right? And that's why things like affirmative action were put in place to create some equality of access for these communities. So that still exists. But I think this is maybe the signal that like the neoliberal diversity approach and like the identity politics approach is maybe reaching its limit, right? And like, how can we conceive of a different way to advance the struggle, an anti-racist struggle, right? And a struggle for liberation for all people, for the equality of all people, for access to education and healthcare, and just basic human rights for all people that isn't a part of this identity politics juggernaut. Because I think it's like a race to the bottom is kind of how it feels at this point. So I don't know if that was very clear. Again, I apologize. I'm not in the clearest mode of mind at the moment, but those are just some of my thoughts.
That was very clear. And here. I absolutely agree with you. And DEI is not a substitute for just flat out decolonization and abolishment of literally everything. But let's start with capitalism. DEIB does not mean that racism is over.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm going to go on another rant, but I feel like I have to because I've been thinking about this. There's a lot of pushback against pretendianism within the Canadian academies, and the university system has created this, program, I guess, of verification, which is problematic on its own terms, right? But in the United States, there's a reluctance, I think, by the left to embrace this kind of I guess I don't know what you would call it, this moment of saying that pretendianism is a really bad thing and it's very harmful to Native communities. And I think partly that has to do with the fact that there are ostensibly prominent people on the left who are pretendians, scholars primarily. and it's something that we have to address. I'm not going to name names. I think people can figure that one out themselves. There are some who are still currently employed by universities, right? And because we've failed to adequately address it from a left kind of position, and to say that like pretendianism is kind of part of a broader theft of native land and resources, but it's also a workplace issue because there are laws like pretendianism actually affects native people. Like much like you get rid of affirmative action, yeah, you're gonna like dumb down your workforce, and there's a reason why they do that, especially to native people, right? There's a reason why employers don't want to use Indian preference laws. They're there, they can use them. It's not like we're like making up like new employment rules. You can actually, a university can actually use them. The only prerequisite is that they're on or near an Indian reservation. And in fact, I read a Supreme Court decision where they found out that Indian preference applies to people who sell jewelry in the Santa Fe Plaza because it's on or near an Indian reservation, right? And so like white jewelers don't have that preference, right? They can use those laws because historically that's what Native people have done, and there's a whole politics to that around whether or not they should have chairs, which is also really messed up, or whether they should have shade to sit under. But anyways, there's laws that apply, and it's an employment issue. So what we've done is effectively, by not addressing it and boiling it down to individual claims, we've ceded all the ground to the right, who is now jumping on this issue. And I just remember this quote from Alito during the hearing on the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I was joking around with my friend Andrew Curley, friend of the show, about we were sending quotes back and forth to each other to say who said it, a pretendian or a right winger. So, but this is one of the quotes I sent to him, and I was like, was it Ward Churchill or was it Samuel Alito? He couldn't guess it, but he says, this is a quote from Samuel Alito. He says, oh crap, hold on, let me find it. Should have had it ready to go. I have to read it because it's really good. In questioning, who counts as an American Indian, he said that it's family lore that we, meaning his family, have an ancestor who was American Indian. I identify as an American Indian because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian, right? And he's using
Alito said this?
Yes.
So he's a pretendian?
I think he's using it in a very cynical way to say that, like, if you can claim based on family lore, then I can claim. And he's actually right, because the left, unfortunately, or I shouldn't say the left in general, but progressive academics would agree with him because they've allowed people to do this. So this is where we see kind of this settler hegemony kind of fold in on itself to protect itself. And this is why something like college admissions and affirmative action, I don't think it was the end all be all of what should have and could have been done. Much more should have and could have been done and still needs to be done. But it just shows you how cynical this individualistic identity, right? Because it's nothing, it's absolutely nothing for white settlers to claim the nationality of Native people or the identity of Native people, because they're already operating within a bigger lie, which is the imaginary kind of nationalism of the United States, right? And that's what I like. I was having this realization. I was like, what is it about it? Like, what is it that like makes them so hateful towards us, and so like what is that? Where does that genocidal impulse come from? It is grounded in a kind of ideology that does literally reaps rewards, reaps money, right? You kill an Indian by becoming one, you will get rewarded in this society for doing that. So I was just kind of thinking about this in terms of like, what are the broader implications and why we need like a really kind of critical analysis and push to like root this problem out, because it's not going to go away. It's not even just about pretendians, right? That's not the whole issue here. And I think lastly, I want to say, and this kind of gets to the final Supreme Court decision, the overturning of Biden's loan forgiveness program is it's like a triple slap in the face. First of all, Biden slapped us in the face because he could have just wiped out all student loan debt, and then that could have been the end of it. You know, just like they sent billions of dollars to Ukraine to fight a NATO proxy war. But instead, he kind of like he made this weak provision in the heroes at whatever it was, and it got struck down because it wasn't a smart thing. It was never meant to last. I don't believe it was meant to last, and I don't think they were very serious about it. I have student loans. I could have actually benefited from this, but the last thing about it is that if you look at Biden's response, nothing he says in his response is actually meaningful. I mean, I watched his speech. It was like incomprehensible. It looked like he just like woke up from a nap, because it's not important to him. This isn't an important thing for him. And he like, you couldn't actually understand what he was saying. I had to read the transcripts later on and then look at his like bullet point thing. But you couldn't understand. He never said about reforming education or even just like, you know, solidifying education rights for everyday, you know, Americans or anything. Is nothing to do with that. It's just more kind of weird bureaucratic, like this and that. We're going to go this way, that. So it's so mealy mouthed that he's like actually just conceding to the right wing, because he has no like moral fortitude to stand against it whatsoever. There's just like no bone in his body that is going to push something that's actually equitable for, like, you know, every like millions of Americans who have this debt. And it's so gross and disgusting. I mean, he is right about this, and I'm glad he actually said something about it. But the billionaire class was bailed out by PPE loans that they were asked not to repay. And that's like, I don't remember, it's like $700 billion. Student loan debt is like 380 billion or something like that. Like, it's pennies on the dollar when you really boil it down. And it's so disgusting. Like, people like are, even if you do have an education, like let's say you don't decide you're not going to have a child, you're not going to start a family, you're not going to like, you know, move to the place where you need to move, or like take care of your family because you have to work to pay off this debt that's going to saddle you for at least 20 years, right? Or maybe for the rest of your life. And if your children are unfortunate enough, maybe they'll inherit it, because that's also happened. So, not to leave it on such a gloom and doom note, but man, we'll be back next week.
How many more decisions are supposed to be handed down? Are we done? Is it?
There's, I think there's another round. I can't remember. There was one more big decision that they were supposed. Yeah, so probably after the settler holiday.
Good times.
So, on that note, I don't know if anyone has any final closing thoughts.
Happy 4th of July.
Yeah.
We've been talking for an hour and a half.
All of you SCOTUSes lie. All of you politicians lie. SCOTUS. So happy 4th of July.
So, fun fact about the Supreme Court. Did you know they actually don't have to wear those robes? They just do.
I don't even want to think about what they're doing underneath those robes when they're all sitting there together in a big room doing their law thing.
Yeah. It's such a weird institution. I think they should just like literally we should pass a law that requires them to wear like clown suits. Like, that is their uniform.
Well, I think they're black robes because they don't want to be taken mistakenly for the Ku Klux Klan. You know, they got to differentiate themselves.
Well, Native people have a very traumatic history with people who wore black robes, Elena.
It's true. It's very true.
I get
of course,
triggered.
here they were brown, but I understand. East of the Mississippi.
Down there, they were brown. Up here,
down here, they were brown. Up there, they were different. Yeah, I get you.
A little bit of dark humor to wrap it up.
Well, we got to laugh about something, right?
Well, everyone, thanks for listening. There's a lot more to say. I think we're all still processing things because this has been pretty rapid fire, I would say, over the last week. But yeah, we'll be back next week with a new episode.